with me. Buck Woodard is a cultural anthropologist specializing in historical and applied research, with interest in ethnographic and ethno-historical writing and ethnological study of indigenous North America. His research area, I got right through that. His research areas include cosmology and ritual life, heritage tourism, kinship, material culture, and political economy. Currently, Dr. Woodard is continuing field work among Algonquins and Iroquoians in Oklahoma, New York, and Virginia. Their research topics include kinship and matrilineality, tribal opposition to state structures, revitalization of language, use, and foodways, and the ways in which the preservation of heritage resources play out in issuing the sovereignty and public representation. Data from his fieldwork and contributing to an interdisciplinary working group, an edited volume, Replanting Cultures, Community-Engaged Scholarship in Indian Country in 2022, and his recent work in material culture research includes a fellowship and interdisciplinary collaboration to study Algonquin objects at the Ashmolean Museum of Archaeology and Art in Oxford at the UK. He is also familiar with us here because he did work at the Muscarel and grants with the National Park Service and the Conservation Fund. Previously, Dr. Woodard directed the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation's American Indian Initiative from 2008 to 2016, and Historic Jamestown's Indigenous Chesapeake from 2009-2014. So I am going to stand out of the way and let Dr. Woodard begin his presentation. And welcome, Dr. Woodard.
Kina, Alan. Winganape, Coach Natapawark, Dr. Renz, Buck Woodard, Coach Wiskata, Department of Anthropology, American University, and Kina Lucy Cochran. This opening just says, welcome, greetings to the people and to some friends that may be here this evening. My name is Buck Woodard, and I'm from the Department of Anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C. And thanks to Lucy Cochran for the invitation and the Hampton History Museum for having me down this evening. As I said before, and for those that are joining us live, I'm usually an animated lecturer. I like to get up and move around, but tonight I'm going to stay with the camera and work from my script, so I hopefully will not put anyone to sleep tonight. I have a paper to work with. We will speak mostly on the cuff, just a very few bit of moments, but most of it will be through the script tonight. And then we'll go for about 40 minutes, and we'll take some questions towards the end. And I encourage you to try to remember those questions or ideas that you want to bring forward. So I'm wearing my glasses so I can read tonight, so it's blurry everywhere else, and I apologize if I can't see you're smiling or nodding off. But welcome, and thanks for being here with me this evening to talk about the Kecoughtan and the expansion of the Pamunkey Chiefdom into the Peninsula area. 20th century scholarly abstractions of Virginia's indigenous Algonquian-speaking peoples typically have focused on the causal features for the rise of the Powhatan polity, and then subsequent Euro-Indian interactions with the English colonists of Jamestown. Less attention has been placed on interpreting Algonquian social politics of the late 16th century, so that's at the end of the 1500s. The period in which Wahunsenacah, we'll come back to that in a moment, the chiefly figure known as Powhatan, expanded his political influence over eastern Virginia. Early English and Spanish historical sources about the Ajacan, Roanoke, and Jamestown settlements indicate that an elite Pamunkey lineage, headed by Wahunsenacah, strategically utilized kinship, marriage alliance, and warfare to politically dominate Chesapeake society. In this evening's talk, I'd like to explore the documentary evidence for the expansion of the Pamunkey Chiefdom and discuss the processes Wahunsenacah employed to exert his influence over multiple indigenous communities in the region. By focusing on the relationship between the Pamunkey Chiefdom and one community it incorporated, those peoples of Kecoughtan, I argued that the Pamunkey expansion may be viewed as a form of native colonialism, or at least empire building. First, some clarity about names. The name Powhatan, or the phrase Powhatan Indians, can be confusing, and rightfully. The early English chroniclers were working with incomplete information and preliminary data about Virginia as an Algonquian landscape and the character of the indigenous peoples who inhabited it. They found a powerful chief of the region, Wahunsenacah, also known by the name of his natal town, Powhatan, a frontier settlement at the falls of the James or Powhatan River, near where Richmond is today. And thus, from the beginning of the Jamestown narratives, there was both a specific person and a specific place named Powhatan or Powhatan. John Smith illustrated the indigenous Chesapeake in his famous 1612 map of Virginia and scrolled Powhatan across the landscape as a means of signifying the dominion of the salvage king, that's in quotes, and placed a cartouche or seal of sorts of Wahunsenacah's royal court in the upper left of the frame. John White's map of Virginia, from a generation earlier, was engraved by Theodore de Brie. It presents a comparatively similar formula, naming what is now North Carolina for the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I, and scrolling her name across the tidewater and anchoring the monarch's coat of arms in the upper left. For the first few years of English colonization in Virginia, the indigenous population were rarely called Powhatans, and few instances exist of any person beyond the inhabitants of that town at the falls referring to themselves as Powhatans. In fact, the name nearly disappears from the written and cartographic record after the death of Wahunsenacah, or Powhatan, and the rise of his brother, Opechancanough. The name that does have staying power in the historical record, and even today, is Pamunkey. The Virginia Algonquian elite were matrilineal, meaning that their descent and family kindred were drawn from the mother's side. From the early English accounts, we learn that Wahunsenacah and his brethren, including Opechancanough, were matrilineally Pamunkey. And so it was through her lineage, the mother's lineage, that Wahunsenacah inherited his chiefly position. So while the English intelligence identified Wahunsenacah as Powhatan by the place of his birth, his kinship group was Pamunkey. And from the landscape between the Mattaponi, today the Mattaponi, and the Yautanan, which is today the Pamunkey River, and this territory was later called Pamunkey Neck. Wahunsenacah and all subsequent leaders of his political lineage were Pamunkey. The House of Pamunkey, in quotes, signed treaties with the English in 1632, 1646, and 1677 on behalf of themselves and those under ancient subjection. Hence, despite the mistake of John Smith and other early reporters from the 17th century, we are dealing with a chiefdom whose elite chiefly leaders were Pamunkey, not Powhatan. And the indigenous entity controlled most of the Chesapeake tidewater was the Pamunkey Chiefdom. Now for a little bit of background about the Pamunkey Chiefdom. On screen, just briefly, this is the frontlet of the Queen of Pamunkey given to her by Charles II of England. And the two signatures there are two Pamunkeys signing the treaty of what's called sometimes Middle Plantation, but the Articles of Peace from 1677 to 1680. And then that's a map of Pamunkey Neck between the Mattaponi and Pamunkey rivers today, where you can see Pamunkey Indian and various different longhouses there. The 15th, 16th century formation of the Pamunkey Chiefdom has been characterized as partially a natural development towards more complexity in an ecologically rich region, and its expansion as a response to the European exploration and settlement of the mid-Atlantic. Archaeological evidence and comparative ethnology suggest that coastal Algonquian societies were increasing in social complexity for multiple centuries prior to English or European colonization. Sedentary horticulture, expanded trade networks, and intensified resource competition fueled the rise of multiple riverine chiefdoms. This portrait, which has wide evidentiary support across the Atlantic seaboard, indicates Virginia Algonquian social hierarchy, community consolidation, and the emergence or maintenance of elite lineages were internal developments, possibly intensified by European interaction, but not created by them. Thus, the centralized authority of Wahunsenacah as the powerful political head of the so-called Powhatan or Pamunkey Chiefdom was in accordance with the wider trend of the Atlantic Algonquian societies. The prevailing scholarly interpretations of the Algonquian tidewater describe the communities of the Chesapeake as dispersed or nucleated villages. They were horticulturalists. They were separated as geopolitical units with hereditary headmen, which were called widowants, or a hereditary head woman, Wahunsenacah, and counselors, the Kecoughtan. They were acted as a governing body. Under the positional title of Mamanetuik, Wahunsenacah led this chiefdom to its most expanded form in the early 17th century. This complex social-political organization has been characterized as a collection of districts forming a paramount chiefdom. Scholars have utilized cartographic evidence from the 17th century, namely John Smith's map of Virginia I showed a few minutes ago, to equate kings' houses with capital towns of chiefdoms. Despite the appearance of synthesis, anthropologists have not agreed upon the form and the function of the Powhatan polity. Disagreements among scholars include conflicting terminologies for the political structure of the organization, a lack of consensus about the chiefdom's constituent parts, and little clarification about the relationship of those parts to one another. Other areas of differing interpretation include the typological nature of the tribute system, the geographic boundary of the chiefdom at the time of Jamestown's founding, and the normative Algonquian descent system and residence pattern. In most cases, these interpretive or explanatory disagreements among scholars have not actually been resolved, nor adequately addressed, owing to a combination of incomplete and inconsistent data from the primary record and shifts in theoretical foci of anthropology. While not suggesting that future archaeological research or historical anthropology should necessarily address all the arguments of previous generations, some problematic areas hint to a possible codification of errors. In recent studies of the Powhatan at the beginning of the 21st century, Frederick Gleach and Margaret Williamson had acknowledged the lack of consensus among scholars about the classification of Wahunsenacah's polity. Most contemporary scholars, such as Martin Gallivan or Jim Rice, have come to use terminological shorthand to describe constituents that compose the Powhatan chiefdom, such as Algonquian-speaking communities, or Algonquian settlements, Algonquian towns, Algonquian territories, but not using the image from before, tribes, individual chiefdoms, a kingdom, or a confederacy. There is reluctance to define the labels of tribe or even group, as might be difficult with the baggage of neo-evolutionary models, trait lists, or other classificatory schemes. Williamson rightly argues such terms as tribe, nation, and shire are less instructive for understanding the constituent of the polity than recognizing the relationship among these parts for purposes of analysis. The question we might ask ourselves tonight: what would the indigenous Chesapeake look like in terms of community and political affiliation in the absence of the Powhatan or Pamunkey chiefdom, in the absence of that expansion? What would it look like without the presence of this very large chiefdom? Pamunkey expansion, let's thinking about the relationship among these parts of the Powhatan or Pamunkey organization as a point of departure. It's instructive to consider the ways in which Wahunsenacah incorporated Virginia Algonquian-speaking peoples into his Pamunkey polity. Nearly 60 years ago, Lewis Benford suggested that marriage alliance struck between Algonquians of the Upper York and Upper James rivers formed the basis for the Powhatan chiefdom. Archaeologically, ceramic types from the two river valleys differed until approximately 1500 AD. Select sites on the York demonstrate a commingling of these ceramic wares in the late 16th century. And this formative history from the archaeological record is supported by Algonquin oral history captured in the primary documents. Wahunsenacah explained to John Smith that some countries he hath, and this is in quotes, some countries he hath, which have been his ancestors, which unto him by inheritance, as the country called Powhatan, Arahatic, Appomattox, Pamunkey, Yautanan, and Mattaponi. Concerning his geopolitical map, John Smith further reported, quote, all the rest of his territories expressed in the map, they have report that this has been by his several conquests. Here we can see the archaeological, documentary, and oral history support for the chiefdom origins to have been along the upper York and James River to include 6 units or territories or countries, which by the 16th century had hereditary leaders from the house of Pamunkey. This chiefdom domain may be called the Pamunkey Crescent, and if you look carefully on the map, you can see that there's kind of a bean-shaped area. That's the Pamunkey area of the upper, what's now the upper York, and then a darker area that's labeled number 2, which is the area of the upper James. And combined, these two create kind of a boomerang shape that we can think of as the original Pamunkey Chiefdom, that crescent that's there. From the time Wahunsenacah inherited his chiefly position in approximately the 1560s, he expanded political control and dominion over multiple other communities to his southeast, conquering, coercing, and manipulating all into tributary subservience. Again, there is disagreement about which communities should be considered tributary to Wahunsenacah, and a lack of clarity about how the groups within the chiefdom internally functioned, how they related to one another, and whether they can be analyzed as similar social political bodies in absence of the so-called Powhatan paramount chiefdom. Were all the groups on John Smith's map of Virginia previously separate? How were they allied? Researchers previously but erroneously called the polity the Powhatan Confederacy. Obviously, conquered people are not equals in league. Researchers have suggested that Powhatan's polity was modeled on a previously existing form, and this may be correct. The organization's appearance, however, of uniformity and a segmentary confederacy-like structure is deceiving. The process of Wahunsenacah's Pamunkey expansion was uneven, and each community needs to be evaluated separately to reveal clues about the relationship between the parts. The community of Kecoughtan may offer one such example for our consideration. 17th century English chroniclers portray Kecoughtan right here in Hampton as a single village at the end of the James York Peninsula, jutting out into the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. John Smith described the Indian town as containing 18 houses, pleasantly seated, this is a quote, upon 3 acres of ground, upon a plain that was half environed, which is the meaning for a half-moon defense, with a great bay of the great river. The community consisted of 20 warriors. Just for the math, that's about 1 warrior per house, quite unusual. According to Smith's first estimate, it was 20 warriors. His later estimate was upwards of 70. That's a little bit better. That gets about 4 warriors per house. So approximately 65 to 260, or 3.5 people per house to approximately 4 people per house, inhabited the community in 1608, according to Smith's ratio and warrior count of population, which was 3 to 10. William Strachey informs us that the Werowance governing the territory was named Pochins, a young son of Powhatan. Other Jamestown-era documents describe the Kecoughtan as a welcoming town, interested in trade, and albeit at times, uneasy hosts. Smith and a party of 30-odd colonists en route to Wahunsenacah wintered in the Christmas of 1608 at Kecoughtan. A quote, being lodged at Kecoughtan 6 or 7 days, the extreme wind, rain, frost, and snow caused us to keep Christmas among the salvages, where we were never more merry, nor fed on plenty of good oysters, fish, flesh, wildfowl, and good bread, nor never had better fires in England than the dry, warm, smoky houses of Kecoughtan. Within 2 years, however, primary sources indicate English-Kecoughtan relations were less than amicable. Following violence between the colonists and Indians, the English laid a trap and attacked the town. Sir Thomas Gates, with a certain number of men, lured the villagers towards the shore by way of a tambourine player. Then, this is a quote, espying a fitting opportunity, fell in upon them, put 5 to the sword, and wounded many others. The rest of the salvages he put to flight, and so possessing himself of the town, end quote. Pochins was absent during the exchange, but his governor and women fled, left his poor baggage and treasure to the spoil of our soldiers. Afterwards, the English planted Fort Charles. amidst the Indian fields. A landscape that, of course, would later be called Hampton, Virginia. The destruction of Indian communities at the hands of colonial invaders is a familiar narrative in Virginia, and more broadly, the Americas. Native responses to the colonial encounter, however, were by no means uniform in all historical settings. While the flight of the Kecoughtan was mirrored at other local Algonquian villages such as Paspahegh, many other communities remained entrenched, fighting fiercely against the colonials for decades to come. Attachment to place, a common name, a unification in warfare are all classic hallmarks of chiefdom or tribal organizations. Yet the ease with which some communities tributary to Powhatan abandoned their territory, such as Paspahegh and Kecoughtan, and the disappearance of certain named tribes or groups soon after the tumultuous years of Jamestown's Anglo-Indian Wars, that's the first part of the 17th century, groups including the Arahatic, Kecoughtan, the Yautanan, the Wereskoyak. These groups' disappearance raised questions about the types of communities being engaged. Attachment to landscape and identities, unified political and military actions, these are all peoplehood characteristics. If Powhatan's organization was a paramount chiefdom, so a segmentary structure that united separate tribes or chiefdoms or chiefly lineages, maybe the chief's houses such as are illustrated on the map behind me in the yellow circles, under a single powerful chief, then how are we to reconcile the dissimilar composition of the constituents? Why did some communities like Kecoughtan and Paspahegh have such small populations, 65, 200 people, to be a chiefdom? And why, after being forced off to their lands by the English, did they disappear as groups in the documentary record, compared to other groups such as the Nansemond, the Wahunsenacah, and the Kiskiak, who have long historical careers in the documentary record and fight on for decades and centuries beyond this point in time? If the relationships between the segments of the structure are not the same, how are we able to discuss the individual groups as equals, functioning in similar socio-political ways based on the cultural norms? Returning to the documentary record, William Strachey provides insight into the experience of the Kecoughtan community during the 16th century. He says, upon the death of an old widow aunt of this place some 15 or 16 years since, this was being written around 1610 or so, so we're talking about 1595, 1594, 3, somewhere in there. It is said Powhatan, taking advantage, subtly stepped in, conquered the people, killing the chief and most of them, and the reserved he transported over the river craftily, changing their seat and quartering them amongst his own people. This statement indicates the Kecoughtan town encountered by the Jamestown settlers was a replacement population. If Kecoughtan was invaded, depopulated by Wahunsenacah, and resettled with the new headman, then how are we to characterize this type of community? Surely we would not consider this nascent group to be a tribe or a chiefdom, a tributary chiefdom, and much less, as some have suggested, a new ethnic group. While researchers of Virginia Algonquians of the past may no longer adhere to the tenets of neo-evolutionary thought, the models utilized to discuss the development of social hierarchy in the Chesapeake need sorting out. Perhaps Powhatan's polity cannot fully be considered without exploring the ways in which communities engaged with and were engulfed by the expansion of the Pamunkey Chiefdom. Thus, I would argue that a reassessment of the documentary record is needed to consider the processes employed by Wahunsenacah to politically dominate the Chesapeake. Drawing on the primary record, it is possible to depict the Kecoughtan community prior to the Pamunkey expansion, and in so doing, offer an interpretation of the ways in which Wahunsenacah incorporated surrounding Chesapeake polities. So let's back up a little bit to another place called Ajacan. Spanish documents pertaining to the failed 1570 Jesuit settlement of Ajacan indicate that Don Luis, a previously captured local Algonquian and Catholic convert, settled the Spanish colony on the peninsula between the York and James rivers. Don Luis, whose Indian name was Patkinkaneo, was a member of a family of status that controlled a series of Lower James settlements. A powerful paternal uncle was the principal chief of that region, as was Don Luis, who upon the return, maybe I'll jump over a slide here. Powerful fraternal uncle, was the principal chief of that region, as was Don Luis, who upon return to the Chesapeake inherited a matrilineal headman position at either Paspahegh or Kiskiak, due to the recent death of the preceding generation. Famine greeted the Jesuit priests to Ajacan, broadly Paquinqueneo's natal home. And by the way, Ajacan is a Spanish corruption of an Algonquian word that simply means my home. That word's Yahacan, minus the Y in Spanish. So much of this famine that some families had to remove to ease their hunger, while others remained to die where their fathers have died. End of quote. Don Luis initially assisted the Spanish with establishing a meager mission, only to later abandon the Jesuits and take 3 wives and residence with his uncle some 20 miles overland from Kiskiak. During the winter of 1571, Don Luis and his relatives assaulted the Jesuits and killed all but one boy, Alonso de Olmos. From the Spanish accounts of the 1571 and 1572 relief expedition, several points may be summarized. First, multiple villages occupied the lower peninsula, interconnected by footpaths and kinship relations. At the entrance to the bay, near the mouth of the James, several inlets appeared as islands, where Juan de la Cara said, "There is a large population on the shores of this port." Don Luis and his brothers were the primary headmen of the region, but an uncle was a leading chief who lived near this port, which is in the circle there, the large circle. The kinship relation is important because we learn that Don Luis inherited a chiefly position upon his return, which in absence had been taken by his younger brother, who abdicated upon Don Luis's arrival. This information confirms that the uncle under discussion was a paternal relation, because if he were matrilineal, or maternal, he would have held the chiefly position inherited by Don Luis's age grade. This kinship evidence indicates that the elites of the 3 groups of the peninsula, Paspahegh, Kiskiak, and Kecoughtan, were intermarried and shared in the ruling lineages of this region. A second point, the Jesuits traveled by land from the James River to Paspahegh to the location of the mission along the York River in Kiskiak territory. The main Spanish port is interpreted as the environs of Port Comfort and Hampton, or Kecoughtan. Hence, the only destination for 20 miles overland between Kiskiak and Kecoughtan, overland, think about it on the peninsula. Hampton History Museum, for instance, is 22 miles from Yorktown. The only direction you can go to make 20 miles. Lastly, the Spanish documents depict that the large population of the Peninsula Algonquins as being interrelated through kinship and marriage for multiple generations, engaged in a network of exchange and alliance, but entirely governed by their own lineage relations 1560 to 1570. There is one clue to another rising power in the immediate region. Juan Rogel's 1572 letter to Father Francis Borgia indicates that after the Jesuits were killed, the altar vestments were distributed to the local village headmen, namely Don Luis's brothers. Yet a silver chalice, however, was sent to an important chief in the interior. It is probable that this significant leader, from beyond the local geography, if I can make that, there we are, beyond the local geography, west of Kecoughtan and west of Chickahominy, was the Pamunkey lineage of Wahunsenacah. The English documents from the 1585-1587 Roanoke colony attempts also shed light on the 16th century Chesapeake. Interviews conducted by Ralph Lane of the Chowan leader Menetanon indicate that 4 days' journey over land, a certain king's country lies upon a sea. His place of greatest strength is an island. In a bay, the water around the island very deep. Menetanon described the Algonquian leader as a shrewd diplomat, an able warrior, and a trader, that is in commerce. The king would loathe to suffer any strangers to enter his country, especially to meddle with the fishing for any pearl there. He was able to make a great many men of the men into the field who would fight very well. Lane also learned that this powerful leader periodically engaged Europeans from his seat on the bay. Quote, "The king had traffic with white men that had clothes as we have for these white pearls. The better sort of his gentlemen and followers are full set with the said pearl. He had such quantity of them that it's a wonder to see," end quote. During a winter visit to the nearby Chesapeakean villages in Chesapeake, the English explorers received multiple Indian delegations, most of which appeared to have not been from the Upper James. Rather, these Algonquian-speaking communities surrounded the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, but also included the Iroquoian Mandoag, or the Nottoway Tuscarora, of the nearby interior coastal plain. Combined, the 16th century English and Spanish documents portrayed the lower tidewater communities as a series of politically related towns, engaged in a regional trade network, but possibly absent of a central authority that linked the wider political geography of Hampton Roads under one dominant chief. The population at the entrance of the Chesapeake was large, with a great many warriors. Near an island or peninsula at the mouth of the bay, there was a deep water harbor where a powerful hereditary headman controlled the peninsula territory between the lower James and York rivers. Kinship and marriage linked the elite status individuals of the peninsula, and possibly also the south side. Archaeologically, it's noteworthy that the late 16th and early 17th century peninsula and south side Hampton Roads produced the same ceramic wares, simple stamped, shell-tempered Roanoke or Collington ware. To their west, two other forms of pottery, previously mentioned, dominated during this time period. These cultural boundaries, while not absolute and likely fluid, at least show communities of practice, whereby the makers of the wares were generationally in different social orbits. That is, the people of the peninsula and those above that of the Chickahominy River. Strikingly, by 1607, when the colonists of James Fort began producing written records, the geopolitical landscape of the lower Chesapeake had changed. The Kecoughtan, Kiskiak, and Chesapeake territories contained only a single village each, towns with an individual widowance and low population density. William Strachey indicates that Powhatan's expansion was the root of this shift, either by force, subdued unto him, or through fear yielded. Wahunsenacah was ambitious, subtle to enlarge his dominions, the territories, either by force, subdued unto him, or through fear yielded. The Kecoughtan Strachey describes of 1,000 Indians and 300 Indian houses was a recent memory in the oral history of the regional Algonquians. From Strachey's 1612 writings, a fuller picture of the Pamunkey Chiefdom's expansion may be gleaned. During the 1590s, the elderly Kecoughtan widowance died and the lineage leadership passed to a younger but ineffectual headman. Soon after the transition, Wahunsenacah seized the moment and struck a decisive blow to the lower James communities. The Pamunkey Chiefdom raided Kecoughtan, killed the new widowance, along with most of the male population. The remainder, probably mostly women and children, were spirited away to be quartered amongst a growing population in the Pamunkey Neck. Select members of the female elite were spared and joined to the relatives of Wahunsenacah, such as Pochins, his young son, thereby legitimating, transferring the land use and political territory to a new generation of Kecoughtan inhabitants. This population density map is rather striking if you look at the size of Pamunkey compared to the size of the previously very large population of Kecoughtan. It's very small now from this map at the time of 1607. It's also noteworthy to note where the large populations are. Nansemond, Patawomac. So think about what are the implications for these groups as polities. Chickahominy. Really, we're looking at the major players of the region. Patawomac, Pamunkey, Chickahominy, Nansemond, at least at the point of the Jamestown's foundation. This type of attack and reconfiguration of the population may be termed strategic patricide, whereby males are removed in order to forcibly infiltrate the matrilines. As bearers of the lineages, women's familial use rights to the landscape would have been crucial to the culturally sanctioned occupation of new territories. Strategically, Wahunsenacah developed a tactic used by conquerors throughout global history. Eliminate the men, redistribute the women, and use sexual domination to produce a new population that had ties to both the old lineage for legitimacy and allegiance to the new figures of power and authority. With a remnant population of key elite women, new settlers from the Pamunkey Chiefdom secured use rights and authority through intermarriage while maintaining and reproducing power structures secured through tribute to Wahunsenacah. Kecoughtan represents the best example of Wahunsenacah's chiefdom expansion and strategic process. Far from being a separate tribe, or chiefdom or an ethnic group, the Jamestown-era Kecoughtan had been invaded, deposed of its male leadership and population, and colonized by multiple matrilineages that were obligated to Wahunsenacah through marriage and kinship alliance. The communities that met the English of Jamestown was a replacement population, replete with installed leaders who applied kinship and marriage vices to legitimate occupation of a forced political coup. In 1607, the Jamestown colonists found few indigenous habitations along the north banks of the James River, from Hampton to the mouth of the Chickahominy. Besides the few people seen at Kecoughtan Town, or Point Comfort as it's known later, the English found only one native village near what is today Yorktown, Kiskiak. So on the map there you can see Kecoughtan, and you can see Kiskiak, Jamestown, but there are no other native villages in all of that peninsula. Nearly the entirety of the peninsula was depopulated, far from the 300 houses and over 1,000 people at one Kecoughtan town alone in the 1590s. Near Paspahegh, scholars have speculated about the wasteland environments around Jamestown Island, why there were so few native inhabitants in that geography. Marshy swampland, crop rotation, stagnant and brackish drinking water have all been suggested as reasons for the lack of native towns below the mouth of the Chickahominy River. However, when viewed from the perspective of recent warfare and the expansion of the Pamunkey Chiefdom, the empty peninsula is more fully explained by the building of Sinacamaca, or Tsenacomaco, the densely inhabited land of the Pamunkey Neck. The fall of Kecoughtan had residual effects upon the Southside native communities. Once their northern ally and kinsmen were subdued, it was only a matter of time before Wahunsenacah advanced on the mouth of the James. Intriguingly, from the Algonquin oral history of the early English records, indigenous prophecies were made that from the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, a nation should arise, which would dissolve and give in to Wahunsenacah's empire. Possibly it was under this oracle cloak that all the lower York and James communities were subdued. At any rate, on or about 1607, the Chesapeake district was invaded, destroyed, quote, destroyed and put to the sword all such who might lie under any doubtful construction of the said prophecy, as all the inhabitants, the widowants, and his subjects of that province, and so remain all the Chesapeans at this day, and for this cause extinct. Basically, Wahunsenacah rubbed out the Chesapeake community, killing not just the men, but the women and children too. The annihilation of the Chesapeake community has been described as having completely obliterated that people with a thoroughness unusual in Virginia Algonquian warfare, a sentiment with which I concur. What is unusual about the Chesapeake is that Wahunsenacah did not import a population to repopulate this region. It might have been at the marginal limit of his territory to manage such a long-distance arrangement, but Chesapeake represents a different kind of warfare, one that was bent on elimination as opposed to subjugation. It may have also been a signal to the occupants of the surrounding geography. The total annihilation of Chesapeake made an example to other provincial leaders. The complete destruction of Chesapeake society without resettlement may have served as a bold and unforgiving message to any wavering in loyalty. Equally, the unification of warriors from across Powhatania probably solidified the allegiance of lineages new to the Pamunkey political organization. As a side note, some level of resettlement of Chesapeake did occur, and that population was probably from the adjacent Nansemen. Strachey, 1612, notes 100 warriors at Chesapeake, and clearly these are not the extinct people he described just a few sentences before. Smith said the Nansemen had 300 warriors, and that he was simultaneously attacked by a combination of Chesapeake and Nansemen when he was exploring the Nansemond River. With the 1580s Roanoke records documenting Nansemond-Chesapeake alliance and cultural consistency demonstrated in the contact era archaeology across the Nansemond-Chesapeake-Kecoughtan region of Hampton Roads, Smith's notes about their unity in warfare is rather revealing. Hypothetically, these 2 or 3 named groups may provide enough information to suggest we're actually looking at one population. The proud and warlike nation of the Nansemen from Strachey's time were the remains of a larger independent chiefdom. The events at Kecoughtan and Chesapeake probably served as motivators for the Nansemen to enter begrudgingly into a semi-autonomous, tenuous relationship with Wahunsenacah, with the Nansemen leadership bowing to enter reciprocal tribute. as a local group. Their eventual stronger affiliation with the Powhatan or Pamunkey peoples occurred because of the increased violence of the English colonization, situating alliances against a common English threat. But what became of the Kecoughtan? In 1608, Wahunsenacah attacked the Middle Peninsula at Pamunkey. He killed many of the men, deposed the remaining lineage Wahunsenacahs, and thereafter he allowed, quote, a new population to resettle the territory. This new settler population was comprised of the Kecoughtan. They had been quartered in Pamunkey Neck for 11 years. Quote, the inhabitants whereof are but few, not now above 40 or 50, and are the remain of the conquered Kecoughans, who Powhatan transported thither for in the year 1608. The Kecoughtan youth of the 1596 or 95, somewhere in there, Pamunkey raid on Hampton had come of age, and having been loyal, intermarried, and reoriented towards Wahunsenacah's vision, were able to argue for their freedom from Pamunkey Neck, or at Senecamaka, but now as part of the Pamunkey Chiefdom. And with that, I will stop because we are at time, at about 45 after the hour, and we have time for about 15, 20 minutes worth of questions.
That covered a lot of territory, and I'm going to come around with the microphone so we can ask some questions. I see one over there already. I do want to remind everyone that this lecture will be on our YouTube. Heavens, Murgatroyd, I don't know what caused that. You can find it on our website and on YouTube later. So.
Hello, hi. I am the descendant of the contraband slaves. The Kecoughtan Indians helped my great-grandfather get to Fort Monroe for his freedom. I was told as a little girl I was just like my great-grandfather, who actually loved to farm, and he was assigned to Shepherd Mallory because they assigned different trades, especially if you have Native American trade, which I had. I don't understand how history forgot that when the tribes were destroyed, they knew the land. They knew the layout of the land. And just like the ones who did not go on the Trail of Tears, they actually formed themselves in different areas and actually continue to live. I think that we have to do more. I know that William Mary is trying to find ancestors from the Kecoughtan, but we have to do more. These records are really good, but you have to understand that the Native Americans who did not go along with the Trail of Tears mixed with my people. And I just hope and pray that we can continue on, because a lot of the Native Americans, they think that my community, my Black community, do not know or forgot. It's just the fact that no one has documented it.
Right, well, it becomes challenging because later in time, we really lose all these names except for Pamunkey and Chickahominy. And then for about 150 years, just Pamunkey. And the other names from the chiefdom were somewhat subsumed under that name. But you're right, people did come down here, and there was a settlement at Gloucester Point, at Yorktown, down here at the mouth of the bay, composed of people from the area today that's called Pamunkey Neck. Possibly they were ancestrally remembering their previous territory down at Kecoughtan or Kiskiak, possibly, because they were living on the same space. So the lineages, for sure, these different groups continue on today, but maybe under different names. And that's where the documentary research becomes important, to try to trace that lineage. I will say before we move on to another question that the name Kecoughtan does appear in the documentary record as a last name.
Oh, a last name, okay, but I know
yeah, so someone, but that's not uncommon. So Wahunsenacah, another group I mentioned, that also becomes a last name. The Powhatan, we have an argument in Richmond about whether it's Powhite or Powhite, right? All right. So, but there is a Mr. Powhite or Mr. Powhite, as a last name too. So sometimes the names of the tribes or the chiefdoms or the groups, I'm not going to weigh in on what they were, but let's just say the lineages of those areas continue on under a patronym adopted through the English format of it. naming.
Yeah, but the Native Americans who did not leave during the Trail of Tears did form their own community and pretty much, very much intelligent, even with the Irish immigrants. They actually united together in South Carolina. And when they told me I was just like my great-grandfather, my Aunt Annie, who's Cherokee, let me know that it was her people who got us to Kecoughtan. It's just when I got here to Hampton, it was all missing. I was just really shocked, just like, oh my gosh, what's happening?
Well, another thing that happens is the names stick with us. So all of you heard some Algonquian tonight, but you've been speaking it probably all of your life, right? You know, Kecoughtan.
All right, hands back up.
Just like class.
I don't know what, it's that camera, I'm sure.
It might be, yeah.
I'm probably going to need this, but I have a very unusual question to ask you. Since pets are so prevalent in the United States today, I've never read anywhere that the Indians had any kind of pets. Would they have had that, or was there any record of that?
Oh, yes. Yes, you know,
what would they be?
It's a different topic, but dogs are very popular here. We have more archaeological, I don't know, Alan, if you know this or not, but we have more evidence of dogs in this region than any other place on the eastern seaboard.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm glad I asked that question.
So dogs would be one.
What about cats?
We don't have any domesticated cats in this area, but there is some evidence that there was some domestication for young deer, but that's very limited evidence. But birds, there's some types of parakeets that were kept by the elites, but they were also restricted pets, shall we say, that not everybody could have them. But
was that because of food shortages?
No, it's because of the plumage. So the Carolina parakeet are extinct today, but their yellow, orange, and green plumage was rare and sought after by the elite. So the elites in this region had control of some substances, right? So some materials are considered by our society today to be more valuable, and in these societies also had value distinctions, and feathers of particular colors were some of those valuables. So maybe that. So some people had birds, but not everybody had dogs.
Well, they should have said that somewhere in history. I've never read that. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. Good question.
Hi, thank you for your lecture today. I had a two-part question. Number one, the mouth of the James, there was a tribe, I'm not quite sure if it was the Wahunsenacah. I have on my mother's side, my grandmother, her mother's side, a second great-grandmother that always said she came from a people that were at the mouth of the James. We know about the Nansmen, we know about the other members of the family, but I wasn't able to quite pinpoint, would that have been Wahunsenacah or?
Well, this gets to, the genealogy questions are really important and really fun, and I'm
really hard to answer.
Very interested in them. So at the point of English colonization, you're right, there probably was a pretty big chiefdom. They included Nansemond, Chesapeake, part of probably Wahunsenacah, and I would suggest even Kecoughtan, maybe even Paspahegh and Kiskiak, but that changed, right? So it became the Pamunkey Chiefdom, and groups became tributary and kind of fell into the house of Pamunkey. Some of the small groups, Wahunsenacah is one around Smithfield, Kecoughtan's a little farther up, and then you hit Roanoke. But those communities all along that area through the wars of the 17th century retreated back to the Blackwater, all right, so below the mouth of the James. That being said, a really untold story that needs, it's been researched, it's been published upon, but it's not widely known in the public, is the story of Indian slavery. And that was prominent at the end of the 17th century into the 18th century. And it's probably the source of a lot of people's oral traditions about ancestry, because it put a combination of indentured servants that were from all over Europe, native peoples, and eventually towards the end of the mid towards the end, Africans into the same households in labor. And it was that labor population that produced a very large population at the mouth of the James and all along the south side and across the middle of the Carolina border. I mean, in the 18th century, Virginia was home to more free people of color than like so many other places because of this interacting, and really 17th century made a population, you know, because when you put people together,
Yes.
they make new people.
They make new people.
Yeah.
They do.
In that way, and it's important for us to look into the records about, so I feel strongly about when seeing the word, for instance, slave in the record, not to automatically assume the origin of that person.
Right, exactly.
Right, to go deeper into that, into that inquiry. It's also the period in which Virginia contributed to in terms of the United States, formation of race as a construct.
Yes.
And that's important to recognize too, that it's really anchored in the labor and the land and these people's interaction in this landscape. So I'm terribly interested in that question, but I can't right away just say, oh, it's the Wahunsenacah.
Okay.
For sure, because I'll tell you, John Kecoughtan ended up on the south side.
Oh, he did. Okay,
So he's
that.
not Kecoughtan from here, but ended up over on the south side. So
Okay.
we see his records continue on in places like Isle of Wight and Surrey.
Thank you for that.
So let's keep looking.
Okay, I will, absolutely. And the only other question I had is during the, so the battle of, I think it's Ajacan, did I say it right? Ajacan, the one we were talking about.
Oh, Ajacan, yeah.
Ajacan,
Yeah.
So was that where, when?
Wasn't really a battle. I mean, it was
kind of a
I mean, it was kind of a handful of Jesuits all got killed.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe there was some skirmishes when the relief supply came, because the Spanish, they came and laid waste, and they were remembered in the oral history of the Chickahominy very strongly. The Chickahominy recalled that the Spanish ships sailed out of their river and down the James with Chickahominies hanging from the masts. Yeah, I mean, and that was retribution, right? And they took that young boy, he survived, they took him back, the Spanish did, so he told stories, but they took retribution for the killing of the Jesuits, but then they gave up on settling this area after that interlude. We still don't know where the mission was. It hasn't been found yet archaeologically. We've been looking for it, but it hasn't been found.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. There's no mention of the zoonotic diseases brought by the Europeans in this story. And Smith talks about how few people really lived in the Chesapeake when he got there. So is there any evidence that the Spanish brought these zoonotic diseases and reduced the populations?
Absolutely. This would be one of the only places on the eastern seaboard that wouldn't have been impacted by virgin soil epidemics. So the questions, we don't really have excellent evidence. We have narratives. We have some anecdotal remarks. Powhatan, Wahunsenacah says, my people have died 3 times over. Is that 3 times over from famine, 3 times over from disease? The arrival of Don Luis back in this area, they say that they've been struck by a famine. But that word in the period might also mean that the people have been struck by some kind of ailment, some kind of disease that's caused some loss of life. They died where their fathers died. The intervals between the 1560s and those missions and forts that were being built in Carolina under Juan Pardo. The 1570s incursions here, we have documents for these different incursions with the Roanoke colony. Before Jamestown, there's all these different interactions with Europeans of various backgrounds, French, Spanish, English. It'd be hard to believe that some of the diseases didn't jump at that point. And so between 1540 to 1600, you got 60-some years of opportunity for disease to have. But when you look back at this slide, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people inside Pamunkey Neck. They didn't all end up there naturally. That is, the small populations that you see, the little circles. This map's from Dr. Martin Gallivan at William & Mary. His book came out in 2016. It's an instructive image. He used Smith and Strachey's data to put together this map of where the population centers were. But you can look at all those small Kecoughtan, Wahunsenacah, Kiskiak, Wittawacomico, even Arahatic and Powhatan, Mattaponi. It seems like all the surrounding areas are depopulated of people. But look at the size of Pamunkey. It's the mothership. That's Winnebago. Winnebago translates in Algonquin to the densely inhabited land. But when you look at that map, it's not densely inhabited. Pamunkey is, but everything else around it pretty much within the, see, look at when you go up to the northern neck, you start seeing Nantucket, Wicomico, Patawomac, those populations start getting bigger. So Pamunkey's had a dragnet of population into its center. So while I think there is some epidemics we can talk about, I think the absence of people in this story are not from the epidemics as much as it is the warfare. But I will say the expansion of the chiefdom may be a reaction to that decimation, a reaction to disease, reaction to indiscriminate warfare and the killing of people, people going missing, getting on board a ship, never came back, went away. So we know that natives end up in Europe. We have records of all those. So I think, you know, it becomes kind of an alarm. And there has to be some cultural logic within the Algonquian communities to agree that we're going to let this guy, Wahunsenacah, control all of this territory. We're going to agree to all these marriage alliances. And I didn't mention this in the story either, but marriage alliance is a really important part of how the Pamunkey Chiefdom came to be. So, I mean, he married young Pochins, was a son that he put here. He had sons all over the place. He had upwards of 80 wives in 1607. 80. So I mentioned that someone took 3 wives. All right. So this is an expansion of that tradition beyond anything that's normal. All right. From those 80 wives, he gave birth to at least 100 children. So 100 new people are loyal to this individual, at least through the marriage alliance. And the elites married elites. So what he's really producing is new chiefs and new chiefly lineages. So I didn't get into that as much because that gets into a more complicated story that's beyond Kecoughtan. This is a good story. This is a good part about, you know, when you use these in tandem, strategies at least. I appreciate the question, for sure. Thank you.
Sorry, I want to turn that down. So maybe here, you had a question? We're going to take a couple more questions, and then we can keep going, but we will log off of Facebook Live.
Okay.
Okay. My name is Tracy, and I had a brief statement.
Hi, Tracy.
How are you? And it kind of relates to the young lady that spoke down at the other end about her relatives. And at the same time, I'd like to make a request to reach out to you at some time to discuss what I'm getting ready to say.
Okay.
I'm from Clarksville, Virginia, Mecklenburg County. Are you familiar with that? The home of the Occaneechi of Virginia, and the ones that eventually, some of them went into North Carolina to form the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi. I think that there are many that never left, and some did stay and assimilated within, and our ancestors are still underneath the water. And I actually know one of the families who owns some of the artifacts that were dug up when they built that man-made lake there. Still hold some of those possessions. But it's just always that possibility in one's head that they never left, as she was stating before. So I'd like to talk to you somewhere.
Sure. Yeah, I think Mecklenburg County, Brunswick, a few others have a lot of resources. Counties that don't have burned courthouses are also very helpful, but it's not just Occaneechi. You know, some of the Saponi 2Ps and Y, you know, they draw their ancestors out of that same area. So, and they share some of the same surnames in multiple communities. So I think there is.
But it's very difficult to talk to them. They don't like to.
Well, now we get into tribal politics. Yes, I completely understand. But in the interest of research, yes, I think that is a real phenomenon, and I think these stories, you know, these oral histories are important.
Yeah, so I'll reach out to you
okay.
at some point just to discuss that.
Great, Tracy.
I got 2 questions. Let me ask them both. In this map, you show the Wahunsenacah living north of the James River. Another map, you show them living south. I was under the impression they lived south of the river and then eventually were forced to move to North Carolina because of trouble with the colonies. Right. Second question is,
okay.
I don't know whether this is true or not, it's kind of far out. I understand from something I read recently that Chief Powhatan gave Pocahontas a large parcel of land across the James River from Jamestown as a wedding present. Do you know anything about that? It's true or false?
I'm not sure of the actual bounds of it, but Rolfe did come back, the son, came back and claimed some of that land. I think some of it also went to some other people too. There's also a tract of land given to her uncle, well, not her uncle, but by our kinship terms, Opechancanough. He had a large tract of land at the mouth of the Chickahominy that he gave to Yeardley, as an example. But there was a tract of land, yes, that's mentioned in the record that was supposed to be some kind of gift. I'm not sure to Pocahontas as a wedding present, maybe, but I think there was some land that was identified that belonged to Thomas, was given to Thomas Rolfe after he returned from, he lived in England for almost 30 years before coming back. Regarding the Wahunsenacah, they're on both sides of the river. All right, some of these communities, the river is the middle of the community, and the Wahunsenacah are one of those peoples. They have great Wahanokes on one side, and their Wahunsenacah old towns on the other sides. So, but they're driven mostly out of the north side of the James River by the 1620s time period, and are on the south side at that point. They fight in the 20s, but then they do remove themselves to the Blackwater, and they do have populations there. But then another group goes farther south, heads to Mecklenburg and Brunswick and those areas, and keeps going. And they end up down in North Carolina, deep in North Carolina, like Raleigh. And we see them in the historical record, but their name's slightly different. They're in the record. The Wahunsenacah are an interesting group. They break up into multiple populations. We can find Wahunsenacah among communities in North Carolina that speak different languages. We can find them among the Nansemond. We can find them among the Tuscarora. Find them among the Nottoway. Interesting population. It's a diasporic population that goes out. But that also, because the name keeps going, and they have a tenacious sort of identity attached to it, this would tend to make me believe that the Wahunsenacah and maybe some of the ones that were around them were also originally a population decimated by Wahunsenacah and broken up and really reduced. So they probably had a different configuration prior to the rise of the Pamunkey Chiefdom too. And those alliances that went to the south side with Nottoway and Meharins and others are probably indicative of that. Wahunsenacah used the Wahunokes as his southern messengers. And his brother, Opechancanough, in the 40s, he said he wanted them to go down and to talk about coming back up and fighting, and they killed the messengers that came down to invite them to come fight in the 40s war. So they cut their ties with the Pamunkey fully at that point. I showed you an image here of a treaty. It's instructive to think about who signed this treaty. This treaty, two signatories here from Pamunkey. The two other signatories, Wahunsenacah as a group, Nansemond as a group, and the Nottoway as a group. So those populations claimed that identity and held that polity kind of character into the 1670s and 1680s. I think that's really instructive when thinking about what makes a group. The Wahunsenacah group, or is it the Nansemond? Is it these just lineage houses or towns? But I don't think looking at John Smith's map and thinking as each king's house as being a separate tribe or a separate chiefdom, that's an error. And that I think needs more discussion, and because it doesn't fit, it just won't work anthropologically, and that's why I think it's interesting to think about the Wahunsenacah, because they're a group that has staying power. Into the 19th century, I can track people with the last name Wahunsenacah, even in the American Revolution, fighting as Wahunsenacah with the last name. Pretty interesting people. We're done with the Facebook people.
Well, we're going to do two more.
You're going to keep them going. You guys.
I just spoke to our Facebook master.
Staying live. All right, here we go.
We're going to go two more, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Okay.
And then we will. Hey, we'll go on. They'll all go out and have a drink. And we'll keep talking.
Timeline 1570. You mentioned histories. How were they recorded from then, and were they stories that the indigenous people told the English and Spanish, and these are the recorders, are the Spanish, and then the English Strachey, the Englishman's
Strachey.
Mm-hmm. Did those histories go back to England, or did they always stay here?
So here's the thing about the 1570s. They're in Spanish, and they're in Spanish of the 16th century, which is not the Spanish of today. So in terms of research, we're at the mercy of people who can both read and speak Spanish, but also can work in the cramped penmanship of the 17th century to translate documents that are like on the screen there. That's a document from the people who wrote about coming here. So we have different captains. We have different religious people, you know, individuals like Jesuit, who are writing down their experiences. Don Luis, Jim Horn's got a new book out about Don Luis and his ideas about who Don Luis might be. Good narratives, good stories in that text. I don't think we agree on the identity of Don Luis, but it's instructive to think about Don Luis Paquinquineo from here, Hampton, you know, region generally, being abroad for 10 years. The man was a real Forrest Gump of the Atlantic world. I mean, he did Seville, he did Madrid, Mexico City, he was in Cuba. You know, he went all over places, and he, you know, even had some, you know, audience with pretty important people in Spain. So while we have documents written by visitors, ship captains and others, military men, there's also records of interviews with Don Luis when he was abroad. And I suspect that if a good archivist who wanted to hit the archives in Spain diligently can read the material, there's probably more to find out about these people here and about this world that are buried in the Spanish archives in Seville and Madrid and elsewhere. So when I say oral history, it's a Spaniard writing down what a native said about the past that they knew of. In the English version, the English are all writing notes to, I mean, as ship captains, and Strachey was the secretary of the colony, so he's writing like a history of the colony and trying to keep track of everything. He also copies a lot from John Smith. There are also, you know, learned men who are visiting with natives in England. The Lost Colony, as we know it, Roanoke voyages, they brought Indians with them to England from the Carolinas, and so Thomas Harriot, for instance, is busily transcribing, trying to translate Algonquian and create a new alphabet for Algonquian in the 1570s. Pocahontas, she left here, went to England, died in England. She didn't go by herself, though. She took an entourage with her. Some came back, some stayed. Those that stayed for years. And there were men that were spending time with those individuals and writing. So I think there is still yet records to be found that come from native English, native Spanish interactions that we haven't examined yet. But so I'm using a combination of documentary sources from the eyes and lens of a Spaniard and Englishman, but also through the translations that are provided by native peoples. Some of them, you know, of course, probably colored, they're probably political, but you know, when we look for triangulation, multiple individuals saying similar things, and then if we can confirm some of that archaeologically, confirm some of it linguistically, then we start to really begin, I think, to have a firmer sense of what happened deep in time. So that's a little bit about the records, at least, and where they came from. You're welcome.
All right. Last question.
Back to the Kecoughtan's.
Sure.
Why? So weren't some of the Kecoughtan tribe wiped out by the English colonists? Mm. But what you're saying is those were Kecoughtan's that the Powhatan had replaced the original Kecoughtan's with. Okay.
Yes, that's right. So we have, just imagine one town, but there are probably multiple towns, because the Jesuit records are talking about this uncle's at that town and he's over at this town and we went to that town. I mean, there's people all over the place apparently, but when we get to the time of Jamestown, there's only one town and it only has 65 people in it. Okay. We look at the records from the Lost Colony, and we look at the records of the Jesuits, and then we hear the oral history that is written about it. One town had 300 houses and 1,000 people living there.
Oh, wow.
And then we have only 65 people and maybe 5 acres of land and 15 houses. And so you do the math between 15 and 200.
Okay.
And then the math between maybe 1,000 and 65. So yes, the population that the Jamestown spent time with at Christmas, did I have that slide coming?
Do we have an idea exactly where those 65 people were located? Like, is it where Kecoughtan High School is today? I teach in the Hampton City Schools, so kids want to know.
Yeah, I think it was found. I think there was a good candidate for it. I don't know the archaeological site number, but I know that I know that there's been some serious late woodland archaeology in this region. Partially, some of it's probably obscured by things like Fort Monroe and various other Civil War forts and occupations and pavements, and some of it may not be. I think there's some good candidates. I don't think we've definitively found which Kecoughtan the Jamestown folks spent time at versus which Kecoughtan was the one raised by Powhatan and depopulated. Some of these names are really like place names. So we're doing business as the Kecoughtan, but the name of the people, when I opened up tonight, I said Lenape. Lenape is the name for the people. It's like the name of the people is Lenape. That's what they call like the real people or the people. Might not have been their identity, but it's kind of like humans. Some of these names are place names, but they get stuck as peoplehood names. So even though it might be the place of something, the English are like, you're the so-and-so place of something. So like think of like Virginian and put a, Virginia, put an N and an S, Virginians. It's still a place and it's a people. The slight changing of the word to make it say from Chowan to Roanoke or Roanoke, you might be getting a kind of a southerner, a southern person or southern people, and a southern place. All meaning southern, but just variations of the word. So I haven't really done work on Kecoughtan, in terms of etymologies, but it probably is a place name. And so the people who come here kind of take on the mantle of the place. Even though they may have been Pamunkeys, they become Kecoughtan, right?
Okay.
So that identity then becomes complicated, right? And then maybe John Kecoughtan takes his name because it's a place name, and he's like, I'm from Kecoughtan.
Right,
so,
right.
But is he Kecoughtan Indian?
Where surnames have traditionally come from. Place
Right.
names.
And then lastly, to make it more complicated, the English lens on this is also from a late medieval perspective. So they're used to saying things like court and kings and queens and shires and tributary, and they use this language to describe the landscape. So we also have to put our goggles on for late medieval Europe to think about how they're seeing things, because the Duke of Norfolk, who's called Norfolk, his name really isn't Norfolk. Right? That's his title, and then like his territory,
Exactly.
his duchy. So when we hear something like Powhatan, it's Powhatan the man, Powhatan the place, Powhatan the people, are we really seeing Norfolk, the Duke of Norfolk, and Thomas Gainsborough, or whatever the name might have been? So I think this all needs some sorting out and more discussion.
Okay. Another quick question. Why was the history of the Jesuits in this area suppressed for so long?
Oh, yes. I think that has to do with the anti-Catholicism and anti-Spanish history of an Anglican and Protestant New America, English-speaking America. So the Southwest and anything having to do with the Floridian, Spanish, or Jesuit, or anything Catholic, pretty much oppressed in favor of Jamestown being the #1 and the first and the only. And right, so we don't really. I mean, it's not just Jesuits here. Right. The Juan Pardo forts across Florida. I mean, excuse me, across Carolina. New research, archaeological research, has found those forts and put together a new narrative through the 1560s, cutting right through the Piedmont of Carolina into Virginia, and translating those documents, finding the archaeology, putting that back into the narrative of this early colonial encounter, really changes the landscape of this region to have 6 Spanish forts, Spanish missions, to put Frenchmen in the bay, then to start thinking about the English that didn't make it before Jamestown. There's a lot of Europeans running around this part of the world. So back to your question about why the rise and where did those diseases come from in the warfare, I think bringing that Spanish story forward and that Catholic story forward is going to be instructive in the future.
Interesting. And we certainly didn't hear about it when I was in high school.
Thank you. Great questions. And thank you all for adding to the discussion tonight. Thank you, Dr. Woodard, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Alan.
I will take advantage of the fact that this will be on our website and on YouTube soon, because I'm going to have to go back through and slow down and learn what I've heard tonight. So thank you for joining us. Remember the 16th, we'll be back in here with concert. So good evening.